and I will start my presentation. So let me know when you're ready. All right, it's recording.
I think yeah, go ahead.
All right, well, hello everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. I've had a chance to meet Suchi and Regina a couple times, and Suchi and I met in our prior existence before. And what I'm really excited to do today is not talk to you about data science because you're the experts in it, but really to take you through a journey of, that kind of is part of the journey that I've taken as to why we should be thinking about data science, technology, AI, whatever we're making, our world in a different way, probing and sort of questioning. And what I will do after I've done that is come back to concrete things. So my journey has really been, I ask fundamental questions like, what's trust? Like if we're building trust in AI, what is it? And then I come back and experiment, making something very concrete, which makes me sort of move away from theoretical words to real words. So if you kind of glaze over with just talk, bear with me, we'll get to specifics. And then once this part is over and we get to Q&A, I am happy to answer very specific questions. We'll have a call to action about things that you could do concretely. And really, I want to hear from you, because I think you have a lot more power and agency than sometimes you might realize in this area or just generally professionally. All right, so here, let me know if you see my presentation. And
yes,
I will move to presentation mode. So the question that I'm probing is, and you notice I'm always changing it. So the talk title says, why trust matters and how can we get there? And I dropped the how because, I go vacillate between more or less excitement about this whole area. So now my question is, can we get there? Why trust matters, but can we get there, and how far can we get? The question that I have been really, really thinking about for a long time, and I have experience managing a UX team, engineers, testers, the whole ecosystem of product managers, the product development cycle, and some data scientists. And what helps me is to step back and see the relevance of what I'm doing. As you know, in your work, data science, we get specifically caught up, or we're required to think about where do we host things and platforms and specific decisions. But what really separates us is the art of data science, the inferences we make, the conclusions we get to. How will we design our future? And how will that design us, our interactions, our homes, our relationship to our own self? This is pretty much nags me in the back of my mind as I raise my child, as I make decisions, as I have one-on-one meetings, group meetings, interactions like this. I think about that. I think about the impact of the interactions. And kind of, we get to that place. What are we really doing, and what will it do to us by looking at things in a clearer way? And we have a problem with responsibility. And Alex wrote this amazing article. I put a link there, so check it out when you have a chance, and I'm happy to post it later on too. He calls it our irresponsibility problem. And I think he really articulates how we have created a culture of benefiting from this move fast, break things, but not really waiting to fix the challenges. And every sort of, when we look through statistical lens, we sometimes forget the particulars, or every scandal breaks out, but we go on doing things kind of the same way. We all pause and say, oh, that's terrible. And then the speed just kind of takes over. The other challenge we have is equity. And this group already knows why it's important. And other groups, I have to spend more time on this. But I chose to look at equity in a different way here. You know, gender and identity and all of those matter. They're very, very important. But let's look at the basic access, the question of access, the question of the kind of bandwidth that people who even have access have. So let's start with electricity and then the internet. And then you can say what kind of internet. Then you can say what kind of devices on that internet. And so equity is a question that goes deep, deep, deep. And then you can look at global equity versus usually what conversations take place when we talk about AI and data science. Who is at the table? What are we talking about? The other problem that's very interesting that I am super interested in is the trust problem. Because the trust problem has in it embedded the equity problem, the irresponsibility problem. And it's almost a metric that I'm gauging. I'm wondering if trust can become a metric that we use to track how well we're doing. And this is a report, you know, that came out earlier in spring and said that people really don't trust how fast we're moving, and they're worrying that we're not going to know what's real, what's fake. And there's much debate going on there. The image I have is one of the examples that I've been studying and probing. This is a teenage bot. Obviously, it's not real, but it's made to look so real that, and it's described as sassy, and has 660 million users. And Microsoft spun it off in July this year. So there's a lot more to be said there, and I'm about to publish an article called The Case of the Creepy Chatbot. So there's more there, and we can talk about it more in the Q&A. And by the way, feel free to interrupt me anytime. And Regina and Shuchi, if you see a question, feel free to help people unmute and ask. So,
Absolutely.
So, you know, we can go on and on. We can spend the entire hour talking about the problems. But the reason for me to mention and categorize them in equity, trust, and irresponsibility is because that's what makes sense to me with the world that we're creating, where I come from. I am steeped in the business of technology making. I've seen the evolution of 5G, mobility. I've seen where we've worked with IoT and cloud and AI, and now they're all converging to basically affect, disrupt, help, however you want to, you know, whichever verb makes sense to you, all of our social systems, be it inside our homes, how we interact with each other socially, how we engage with ourselves. And there are projections of, you know, how many zettabytes of data we're going to have. And this is going to be a $13 trillion industry, just the AI portion. And, you know, all of these projections, it's hard to hold. And, you know, I found an interesting visualization of what 44 zettabytes look like. And I haven't done the math, but this one site was saying it's like every person in this world, if they had 25 smartphones, you know, that's the kind of data we're talking about. So what are we doing with this data? And are we prepared with the amount of transformation, you know, this will bring? And the part that I didn't bring up here is also the shifting demographic. Even prior to what happened this year with Corona and the shutdown, more and more kids are entering this space. So when different groups who have different level of understanding of what happens with data, how data gets treated, how it gets used, enter, different considerations need to be taken into account. And are we prepared? Now, this used to be, a couple years ago when I was looking at it, one of my side projects. You know, responsibility, responsible AI, responsible innovation was something that was kind of like nice to have, something you worked on the side. Now, in June 2020, Gartner has put it front and center. And this is something you already knew. It's always about how we make decisions and the intelligence in making decisions. And yes, we want smarter, faster, but can we also make responsible AI? So this language is now entering and has entered the mainstream. But it isn't an easy problem to solve. And I call it the hard problem of trust. You can call it the hard problem of ethics. You can call it the hard problem of responsibility, of accountability, many, many words. But it's really driven by what you do, because everyone is in some way, has been for a long time in history, and now in a volumetric way in the data business. And as you know, I'm saying data science. What does that even mean? It's not one thing. It's a complex and fast and distributed systems. We all come together, many vendors, many solutions, many disciplines with their nuances. So in that case, when we talk about data and responsibility or data and ethics, or even just making good data, can we have a common decision-making criteria? Something that helps us navigate the volume, the speed that's needed to make decisions, analysis, sources, types of data. What is the integrity of the data? Who owns the data? Do we have consent? In the lineage, did we lose that visibility somewhere in order to make sense, or because of where we bought it from? What about privacy and security? What about bias and ethics? This is a lot to worry about. And these are not simple concepts. Do we know what to do? And do we know how to do it? What would it look like if, while we were doing all this, thinking about all this, human well-being, the impact to our future, our environment, could be central to the conversation? And are we incented in the current system to do it? It's a little bizarre if you really think about it, that we are not incented to put our own interests, in business, but the structures are the way they are. If we look at the world the way it is, that's one of the questions that we run into. And in lots of forums that I'm working in, there's been a lot of questions about, there's a set of people kind of going after it from a technology, basis, the fact, like the fairness, accountability, transparency, creating algorithms, creating solutions that are just technology based. Technology will solve its own problems. There are people who are debating all the principles. What do we really mean by transparency? And it's important to ask those questions. And then there's a group of people who are trying to figure out the practical implementations. Do you have toolkits? Do we understand it? How hard is it? Can we integrate it? Should it be separate? How do we operationalize and connect all of this together? Where does it sit in your organization, in your ecosystem, in your decision-making criteria today? It's not an easy problem to solve. It's okay if you don't have an answer, but that's really what we're talking about. And that's what motivated me when I left my foundry to start this Responsible Innovation Project. I started it reluctantly because I knew this is a hard problem. But the only way we will get there is if we create an ecosystem and a community and ask these hard questions. And the goal of this project is to start laying the groundwork today, because as you know, in your own ecosystems, we make so many decisions every single day. And we're sort of biased to momentum, right? So if we're moving and we're building things, if you figure it out 2 years from now, all the decisions that are made between now and 2 years from now would have suffered. So even if it's an approximate solution, what can we do today to start making small shifts while we continue to look at long-term implications, long-term solutions, long-term alignment? And this other part that's really interesting, that's part of this project, is we want to probe, just like we did for the diversity conversation, right? We said diversity adds value. My hypothesis is that responsible innovation will bring cognitive diversity, which will bring experiential diversity, which will bring value and collective well-being. And that's something we want to verify. And currently we have, some community-led initiatives, and we'll talk about call to action. And a couple areas we're looking at is the input, which is your sort of domain, data. But I also put history in there, and I don't mean just historical data. We all talk about historical data, sort of propagating our biases, but more structurally. because what we're inheriting are systems that are not equitable. And that happened way before, the current digitization or internet came into place. There's a reason, and there's a set of benefits, and there's structural inequity built into our system. We always put that in there, or into our language, into our interaction. So I don't want to get too esoteric or theoretical, but that all matters, and that's the input. Then there's a decision-making models and algorithms. Then there's the interfaces of humans and machines and how we think about them. And then there's a lot of emphasis on algorithm and data, ethical data. But there's other emerging technologies like neurotech, BCI, or hardware that's embedded, or ML that's embedded in chips, that people aren't really probing what the impacts will be for that into considering what a responsible ecosystem looks like. So I'm going to just stop for a second to sort of gauge on timing. How are we doing on time, Suchi and Regina?
I think we're okay.
Okay.
We still have time, but there's one question that came in from Tina. And Tina, I want to do it justice, and maybe you want to chime in if there's a question in there.
Yeah, the question is, everyone can read the post, but the gist is companies, large companies that work with data, many of these companies sell that data, or they use that data to drive advertising or other metrics, but it comes down to revenue. And if the leadership is not going to curtail or watch trust until the revenue is impacted, till there's enough momentum to say we don't trust your company, your reputation of your company is at harm, how do we organically as women, first off, that get a rare voice at a company, and of course then we get well, you guys are always worried about trust, you're women, to really influence that conversation and say that this is actually will benefit the company. I'm at a loss on the how as well. How do we do it organically inside a company?
Yeah, I think that's a terrific question. And I've been looking at, I was looking at how to do it inside the company where I was, when I was inside the company. And now the experiment that I'm part of is that I think you need to be inside and outside. And so I'm trying to create a community outside the company that can partner and fuel that resource. Because I think it's very hard to be, depending on the culture, it can be harder to do this from inside the company unless you've created and mobilized and created a community. And we'll talk about that a little bit, about some of the strategies when we get into Q&A. And remind me again if I don't cover it, but we'll talk about some strategies that worked and didn't work, and we can also poll other people in the audience to see how they can accomplish it. But one of the strategies that I am working on, and it's in a report called Operationalizing AI Principles, is how do you what can you do internally and what you actually need from an external community, not just should want to have, but really need to drive, because you have these biases, and no matter how motivated you are, it's going to be different. For example, I thought I was thinking about this problem clearly when I was in AT&T or Singular, but I wasn't thinking about it as clearly as I'm thinking about it now, when I have more autonomy and freedom to say what I actually think and allow myself to probe things that I couldn't, because I kept thinking about part of my identity was defined by making that company successful or staying in line with the message of that company. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right. So sorry about that. There was, I don't know if you could see some of my personal email there. So I had to kind of fix that. But let me know if you're seeing the presentation again.
Yes.
But so thank you for asking that question, Tina. And really, I can have clarity, I can arrive to a conclusion, but this shift that we're talking about to an ecosystem of responsible innovation really needs people to get on board and find their own fine-tuned solution for two reasons. One is I think that's our culture. And I think that's how our mind works. You know, if someone gives us a dogmatic checklist, there's some of us wired to want to subvert it, find a new way, hack it, figure a way out. We know that because we have a lot of checklists and compliance. And so after the fact compliance, after the fact checklist, or somebody else telling us what to do has its limitations. I'm not saying that's not needed. It doesn't have value, especially in high risk areas, but it has its limitations. So we held a roundtable in August called Responsible AI and had a question mark intentionally next to it because we were probing the idea or the term that's being used where the responsibility is again being shifted to technology, to the AI that we're creating, as opposed to the people who are responsible for AI or the set of systems or collection of people. And so again, people say, oh, human accountability. Well, I can't even tell, even without AI, half the time who's accountable in my company for a particular decision, a set of decisions. So we have created this hierarchy and, you know, chain of command or whatever, and then we give the person responsibility visibly, but then we know the impact that it has to the organization if somebody makes a mistake or error happens or somebody gets fined. And that's a very punitive approach. And I'm looking at a slightly different approach. But before we get to that, this roundtable, and you might appreciate it, was designed to bring diversity to the table, cognitive diversity to the table. And I'm pleased to say that that by itself brought in 43% women. Now, we didn't get to 50, but we weren't trying to get to any percentage. We wanted to see what gender diversity will come in if we focused on basically areas of diversity, which were where we brought in humanities, business, and policy and governance along with technology. And I can talk a little bit during Q&A of why we think the technology part being at least 50% is important in there. What was also very interesting, and you'd be interested in this because data integrity, I thought, would be the prime sort of area of concern. So this one, on the left, or the graph shows, the bar chart shows the areas of concern that came up in the survey. But if you notice, they're all very close. There isn't like one huge winner, though transparency and accountability are inching up. And they're all about data, right? So privacy, surveillance, transparency, everything, you know, how do we measure our success? How do we kind of make the message of accountability? How people present data, interpret data, the wisdom of using the data in a thoughtful, careful way. All of that is covered in here. And these are 50% of the people in this roundtable describe themselves as researchers. And these are people who are like actively working or very interested in the area of bringing responsibility to AI. The other metric that I think would be interesting is the, you know, and again, you're the first ones to see it because we haven't made this report public yet, is what Edelman called the trust gap. And I'm thinking about calling it the trust potential. And I'm still working on that language. And why does it matter? So the red line that you see is basically what the survey participants thought these institutions were capable of. So this was their capability of putting public interest into the technology. So tech companies and governments show high capability. And the blue line says, what are they really doing? How much do we trust them to put public interest into their solutions? The tech companies, I expected it to be low. The government, it was interesting. So, you know, if you look at the percentages, I'm still working it out, but it's about 30-ish to 20-ish% gap in trust. And this isn't to saying, you know, max, like I trust them always. People are realistic. They're saying, well, you know, tech companies are going to have some reason to put their business model first. We get it. Governments have vested interests. We get it. But within the potential of what they can do, where they can be, there's a gap. Why does it matter? It impacts innovation, how you think about innovation. It impacts how you adopt innovation or technology, and it impacts our future. Remember the fundamental question: how are we designing our technology, our systems, our future, and how will that design us? This is the gap that I call the opportunity. This is where we can move and shift and make progress, because our capability, and these are researchers, these are people who are actually working in this field, and they see a potential to fill this gap, which is very sort of, encouraging. So I wanted to shift to one of the fundamental things in the Responsible Innovation Project, which is the framework that that I've kind of been working with. And this framework isn't a how-to guide. It's not a checklist. It's meant to be a visual reminder of the larger ecosystem, the larger question. How are we designing the world, and how is it designing us? How do we view the world that affects the decision we make, the concrete, specific decisions we make? How do we see laws, market, and norms that influence our decisions? How do we see people, things, and our environment, which could be bigger than our planet, our universe, and nature, time, our resources? And what values do we infuse in them? How do we think about the values working with and against each other? And I don't know if we have time to go through this framework, and if we don't, we can do it during the Q&A. But really, to just give you a really quick overview, what I started doing was studying what responsible innovation, responsible innovation has been thought about, and why didn't it work, or where did it stop, or why is the impact not bigger? And it's not in any way judgment of people who have been working on it, but really, let me reframe it. I was looking at how do I bring responsible innovation into technology, in our technology making, because it was primarily concerned with environmental sustainability, and how do we invest in our planet now so that we would have resources in the future. And I kind of reinterpreted it to the decisions we're making with AI and technology today. And really, no matter what we are doing now, the probing is that we want to think about the impact in the future, a long game, because future comes sooner than we think. So what decisions can we make differently today in the way it impacts the future? And, you saw the synthesis, and each synthesis is kind of like a spherical, it's a 2D view, but it's really a spherical view that I was imagining or reimagining. And one of the things that we always did in our stakeholder groups, we thought about our stakeholder groups as the client or our customers, and it kind of limits the way we think about things. And I've been sort of looking at how cognitive science and AI, from Turing tests or the imitation game, or like what we think good AI is, has evolved. And do we think about people, things, and our environment, our nature, our time, resources in a sort of fuller way? If we thought about stakeholders in a fuller way, what would that do to our design? If we thought about our values and we put delight first so that we don't get stressed out, because one of the things in these AI ethics, responsibility, trust is, it stresses us out. It's no fun, Can we bring delight to the table? Can we say, oh yeah, it's trustworthy and delightful? And see how we design it with the interconnected view of the values. Because there isn't an absolute way to be delightful. There isn't one way that I can give you a checklist or a formula to be delightful. And there isn't one way to be trustworthy. There's no one way to be dependable or inclusive or open and safe. But these are trade-offs. When we're open, which sounds great, we sometimes are not safe. If we record our kid, doing something and put it everywhere, and we're just sharing everything openly, we're potentially creating an issue with safety, which can then affect our privacy and dependability. And sometimes the same thing happens with inclusivity. If you try to be too inclusive, sometimes you can't get off the ground, or you have to make your product so dependable or you have to test the dependability in so many different permutations. It can keep you from including them. But could we sort of inch towards it and say, we started from like 0, we're going to go 1%, 1%, 5%, 10% towards that direction. But this binary thing that we have, we always love lists, right? So even the AI and ethics groups are coming up with these lists. They're thinking about it in a very complex way, because I've been in those conversations. But they show up as these lists. Here's my list of principles, and everyone says, oh, am I transparent enough? Am I explainable enough? But they're all connected. When you think about transparency, to be open, what's the relevant transparency that makes sense for that scenario, for that set of stakeholders? We do that today. We do that today with business needs, as Tina pointed out. We make decisions. We kill projects because they don't make business case, or somebody else got there first, or it's not competitive, or it's going to affect our PR. Could we put our well-being, could we put these other traits that will have a longer term effect in how trustworthy we are, what the adoption is, the value of our proposition? Can we put that into our design criteria as stakeholders? And my, again, hypothesis is that if we wait for the leaders and the governance and everything to be formalized, then it's going to feel burdensome. But if we as practitioners, we sort of under the radar and in our way of doing things, kind of like not only just even code, like Hippocratic oath or just taking an oath, but really make it integrated into sort of our code, like scientists who kind of, don't do the proper research get tagged for, not being trustworthy, or doctors who sell out their patients' data. There's a norm. There's a pressure of the norm. And that's really in the set of influences, which is laws and market and norms, the area that I'm focusing on with the Responsible Innovation Project is a set of norms. Could we change as individuals and practitioners the way we make things, even almost under the radar, even without asking things, even within budget? Could we just change one thing, include another group, make something trustworthy, clean some data, expose the source of it, and then could we put that, and I'll share examples with you during Q&A about some strategies, but could we put that in front of our leaders, and if you are a leader, on top of that, stakeholders for your customers, and say, here, I'm showing you the implication, you decide, right? So if you don't have the autonomy to make that business decision, put the onus on someone else to make that difficult decision, which somebody would say is responsible or ethical or trustworthy, however you want to define it. So that's kind of, the overall kind of goal and the journey that I talked to you about. Now, we're not going to get to that journey just discussing ideas. And so what we're doing, first thing is you take personal responsibility. What you do depends on where you start from. So if you are just kind of entering this space, then you start training yourself, teaching yourself. If you've been thinking about it for a long time, then maybe you get involved. Come join us, be part of our project, help us create tutorials or guides, or assess all the guides that are out there that we find lacking in being actionable or practical. What can make it practical? They're really amazing work. They've taken it to a certain level. It's like a scaffolding. They brought it here. It's a baton they're passing. What can we build on it as practitioners that would help us? And by showing that example, we can show other people who may not apply it the way we apply it, but they would apply it based on their beliefs, their culture, their business model, and tweak it, ask the questions for themselves. So today, and we'll talk again in Q&A, what I wanted to do was invite, and if people are moved and excited by this conversation, we would love to have some volunteers help us in the assessment, help create some open source tutorials. There are assessments of existing artifacts that we're working on, and really help us bridge the gap between guidelines and idea to what can we put in practice. Maybe just help us create example repository by applying it and saying what's wrong with it. Say, hey, Alka, your framework sounds good, but I try to use it and just doesn't make any sense. It falls short here, here, here. I need these 3 things to help me. This guide is great, or it just made my job worse. Now I'm stressed out. What I need is really this, this, this. I need 2 practical things to do. One thing, can we get every week some sort of a one idea, whatever that may be. I'm giving you a bunch of ideas that I keep, staying up nights thinking about. But really, we need diversity of ideas, because I can only take it as far as my biases, my experiences, and my capabilities will allow. And I'm not, an uber data science expert in each area of data science. So all of those people will have to come together. Definitely, join our mailing list. We don't send anything out really yet, so we're not going to flood you. But if and when we create the reports or we have call for volunteers, you will get that. And, you can also email me directly and be part of these initiatives that we're working on. So I know a lot of stuff was thrusted to you, but I will stop now. And I want to thank you for listening so carefully and for your time. And I really want in the Q&A to see if we can really talk about things that didn't make sense to you or made sense to you, or if we want to bring in real life examples of how do we apply this. And when we turn off this recording part, we can get into specifics. You can even share some real life examples. And I encourage other people, this group, this community, and this is why Shuchi and Regina are talking about, how do we bring this into the core group where people can keep talking about it, because it's not like we're going to solve it in a one-time discussion.